Almost from the beginning, bebop had its share of critics. As with most avant-garde music, the reviews tended to be negative. While some critics claimed the style and music were primitive, the musicians chose to think of it as playing with black intelligence. Even the older jazz players had difficulty with the newer, edgier style, with Louis Armstrong calling it noisy and unswinging. Another negative review came in after a critic heard Thelonious Monk play, saying his mind was on anything except the piano. Yet it was this exposure that led to the growth of the genre. It was critic Leonard Feather who called the new style bebop for the first time after the two-note rhythmic patterns played on the snare and bass drum. Critics played a key role in helping spread the influence of the new genre. As discovered earlier, bebop started with Charlie Parker and developed through a small but intense group of musicians in Harlem, New York. This beginning was labeled as the scene-based portion of the movement, so called by social experts. Scene-based is defined by an active or smaller-sized group of artists. These artists are followed by a dedicated audience and are supported by organizations such as Minton's Playhouse. During the early years, the artists worked out their craft after hours at jam sessions in any nightclub that would house them. Another factor in the scene-based genre is that can be multiple different scenes that were not located next to one another but have similar ideas. This happened when Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie traveled to Los Angeles in 1945 and 46. They teamed up with Dexter Gordon, who was originally from LA but had moved to New York City to study with Dizzy and Charlie, to work with the West Coast artists such as Howard McGee, Sonny Criss, Charles Mingus, and Jackie Kelso. These artists had been listening to the bebop albums for a few years and wanted to learn from the original players. As they jammed with Parker, Gillespie, and Gordon, they took to the style very well, considering it a logical extension of harmonic and rhythmic ideas that they had been performing for years. As Cecil McNeely put it, when we heard all this stuff, man, it was just incredible, and we really enjoyed it, and we got right into it. Gillespie tried to complete a southern tour a few times, but had difficulty getting musicians to commit to playing south of the Mason-Dixie line. For those that tried, some were not even permitted to perform in the South and had to take a bus back to New York. In 1945, when the war ended, bebop in New York City began to go downtown to 52nd Street, where there were plenty of white establishments that opened their doors to the bebop scene. This led to the next stage of bebop development, the industry-based scene. This phase of development happens when companies and financial institutions become involved. This is done primarily by promoting individuals and ensembles, booking events, and paying the players. As the beboppers were improving, they needed to make money, money that could not be made in Harlem. Down on 52nd Street, there was more exposure, more people, and more merchandising opportunities. As more clubs like the Three Deuces, Kelly's, Onyx, and the Downbeat Club opened up to beboppers, they found a growing audience. This led to record companies signing up more players to long-term contracts, which led to even more exposure. Even the ban on record production in the middle of World War II, bebop genre progressed due to its exposure on 52nd Street. Media coverage also increased as magazines and newspapers were consistently reviewing the artists. Parker and Gillespie were known to have many opinions printed in the media, some in agreement and some not. This included the discussion on whether or not bebop should be dance music. This was the time that Gillespie began to be seen for the entertainer, promoter, and showman that he was. Parker, on the other hand, turned inward and stuck to performing, becoming known as the brooding genius player. With the 52nd Street exposure came another issue. African American musicians felt that their white counterparts were taking credit for their music. After bebop became the rage, stated Gillespie, white music critics tried to act like they discovered it, and us, down on 52nd Street. This was one of the main reasons the black musicians started exploring and developing bebop in the first place, to make it their music. The musicians did their best to keep it their own by making it as different and as difficult to play as possible. If they could not play it, opined Monk, they would not steal it. With the expansion into 52nd Street, as well as expanding markets on the West Coast and large urban centers, bebop became more mainstream. The artists were more in demand, and record labels like Blue Note Records were putting more money into the genre than before. While still giving the artists recognition for their material, these companies also required the artists to quote unquote mainstream the music through simplification and teaching it to audience members. Some artists thrived under these conditions, such as Gillespie, Monk, and Miles Davis, while others tried to maintain the standards of the original genre, namely Charlie Parker. Gillespie would go on to innovate and entertain audiences for several more decades, continually adopting his style to create new experiences for his audience. As with any musical trend, bebop would find its end coming with the arrival of the next big thing, mainly the influence of R&B, rock, and country music. With audiences, both black and white, starting to lean more towards these other styles, recording companies began to shift valuable resources their direction. This is the transition into the traditionalist scene. In the traditionalist scene, the casual fans move on, as well as their financial resources. What sustains the music of this genre are the players and fans that are dedicated to the original scene-based genre. In this case, bebop traditionalists would reenact and idolize the original members of the scene by performing or playing their work. Media coverage during this period typically became more friendly and retrospective. For example, the February 28, 1964 cover of Time magazine praised Thelonious Monk for not being eccentric, but more of a creative genius. While the genre was still alive at the time, it was no longer in the mainstream of American culture, but relegated to a more cultic following. Bebop is a fascinating genre to dissect and discover. While there are many facets to the formation of this musical style, at the heart of it was the music. It started as distinctly black music, with black musicians simply getting together to express themselves in a culture where they were seen as colleagues but not equals. Throughout its history, bebop has created its own style, from the first blistering tempos produced at Minton's Playhouse to the creation of new rhythm section dynamics. Many of these innovations have been copied and used throughout the jazz genre ever since, such as small combos and rhythm section etiquette. Inside the American culture, the influence of bebop has helped create a more equitable avenue of success for many African Americans. At a time when race relations were tense, black musicians, composers, and band leaders were given opportunities to thrive. This has led to more minority musicians getting breaks in the music industry today. The musicians of bebop, who were tremendously talented, were given the chance to find their place in the world of music. This allowed them to carve out a dynamic that has been felt for generations. Continuing to study this genre will benefit future musicians by looking into the lives and times of the early beboppers. There's much history here that needs to be discovered. How did they come together and put their differences aside to create bebop? What other cultural and economic influences did they overcome to make their music famous?